So I'm pleased to introduce Sarah. Sarah Vinge-Mazer, as the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Centre botanist. Sarah collects data and manages info in the province's flora to inform appropriate conservation measures. Sarah has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Biology from the University of Regina, as well as a Diploma in Natural Resource Technician from Lakeland College. Since 2003, she has worked on a variety of plant-related surveys, research and conservation projects throughout the Boreal and Prairie Eagle regions, and she currently lives in Regina with her husband and 2-year-old dog.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight on this snowy and not terribly freezing, but still cold evening. So what I hope to do tonight in talking to you about the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Centre is demystify us a little bit. Nobody seems to really know what the CDC does. And I think we have a very important role in conservation for the province. So I would really like to get the message out there about some of the important work that we do. So I will just start with a little bit of background to highlight just some of the generalities about the CDC. So we are a product of, I guess, linkages between a bunch of different organizations. So we have a number of partnerships. We're housed at the Saskatchewan Ministry of the Environment. We have staff that are a complement from the ministry, as well as a number of NGOs, the Native Plant Society of Saskatchewan, Nature Saskatchewan, the Invasive Species Council of Saskatchewan, and the Nature Conservancy of Canada. We are also a member of the Nature Serve Network, as well as Nature Serve Canada and the INAM Invasives Group. So the Nature Serve Network, because I don't think a lot of people know what that is either, it's a non-profit conservation organization, and its mission is to provide the scientific basis for effective conservation action. And what it is, it's an international group, basically. So Canada's 10 provinces, as well as the Northwest Territories, are part of it. All 50 states and some countries from Latin America and the Caribbean as well. So it helps to sort of unify groups in using standardized methodology and standardized ranking and all these kinds of things. So the CDC is very lucky. It serves many purposes, but it also has a lot of partners that it can draw from, draw on other people's strengths to help us do the work that we do. So mission statements are boring. People tend to sort of gloss over when they see this text on the screen. But our mission statement really does concisely encompass what it is that the CDC does. So I'm going to read it to you. Bear with me for a second. So the mission statement is to serve Saskatchewan by gathering, interpreting, and distributing standardized information on the ecological status of provincial wild species and communities. So we have a number of different goals at the CDC, and those include conservation of biological diversity, high-quality service to our clients, as well as high-quality science, objectivity, universal access, and being a provincial clearinghouse for species data. So for a bit of a visual on what we do, as I mentioned, the gathering, interpreting, and distributing of data is sort of at the core. So we do this both for species as well as for managed areas, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to do it for ecological communities. We manage provincial species lists. That includes up-to-date taxonomy and the provincial ranking, which I'll talk quite a bit about today. We do focus on what we call elements, and those are the species. But this informs landscape level conservation and management. So I'm going to talk about two of our main functions. It's mostly going to be about the ranking and the assessments that we do, but I'll also touch a little bit on a couple of other things, including taxonomy. So species ranking. The ranking is used as a process to categorize all of the species in the province by their extirpation risk. So I think there's been some misinformation in the past that these ranks are solely based on rarity, and it's not. It really has to do with that extirpation risk, which takes into account a number of different factors. So at the the provincial level, we have the S rank, or the sub-national rank, that's what the S stands for. There's also an N rank at the national level and a G rank at the global level. So how do we determine what rank a species gets? So there's three main things that go into determining what that rank is going to be. And those are rarity, trends, and threats. So again, it's not just about rarity anymore. There's a lot of other stuff that's going into these ranking assessments. So we take this information and we put it into a standardized tool that was developed by NatureServe, and we just call it the rank calculator, and I'm going to show you what that looks like today. That rank calculator is a really handy tool. It's, again, with all of the different jurisdictions across Canada, the States, Latin America, the Caribbean, it gives us a standardized tool. It makes the ranking process repeatable, it's objective, and it makes it consistent across all those jurisdictions. So it's really a handy thing to have, and it's actually fairly easy to use. So for those three factors, the rarity, the trends, and the threats, rarity takes into account range extent, area of occupancy, population size, number of occurrences, and environmental specificity. In terms of trends, we can look at two different time periods. There's long-term trends, there's short-term trends, and we're looking at whether populations are increasing, are they decreasing, are they stable. And then in terms of threats, those take into account the threat impact as well as intrinsic vulnerability based on history. So we have 11 categories of threats, and I'll just let you have a look at them there. They take into account everything from human modifications as well as severe weather events, anything that could basically have a negative impact on the species. And you'll see these again with the rank calculator. So there are some limitations to ranking. No system is perfect, no tool is perfect, but when it's used properly, it can be really useful for coming up with, again, a standardized rank for the species in the province. It is subject to the information that we have to put into it. So in some cases we may have incomplete information, we may have vague information, and that might be the best available knowledge that we have to come up with a rank for the species. We always want to do our due diligence and try and find as much information on a particular species before we do the rank. Sometimes that's not available, and we do have ranks that we can give to species if we're really uncertain, because we just don't have enough information about it. There is also room for us to adjust a calculated rank. So we put a bunch of information into the rank calculator, it spits out a rank to us. If it seems off, we usually run it by an expert on the group, and if it's off, there's no reason that we can't make adjustments to it if it's warranted, I guess. We do try and get, like I said, as much information as we can, both from the CDC, but if we know information exists elsewhere, and from herbarium specimens or museum specimens or that kind of thing, we try and seek that out before we do the ranking. So what do these ranks mean? A rank of S5, so lower on the extirpation risk scale, means that a species is going to be more common, it's less threatened, and it's more stable. And something with on the higher end of the extirpation risk scale, like an S1, means that it's going to be more rare, it might be declining, and there's usually a high threat level for that particular species. So species that have a rank of S1 to S3 are of conservation concern, so that's where we focus our priorities for conservation work. We can also have a range rank, so like an S3, S4, that means that there's sort of a bit of uncertainty surrounding that species, and so there's sort of an equal chance that it could be an S3 or an S4. It does not mean S3.5. Lots of people think that when we have those range ranks, we kind of average them out, and that's about the rank. It means that it could be either one, and there's enough uncertainty there that we can't place it in either category. We can also have a question mark following a rank, which also indicates some uncertainty, and that means that, so in this case for an S4 question, that means that there's the highest likelihood is that it is an S4, but there's enough uncertainty surrounding it that it could actually be an S3 or an S5. And then we have a couple of other ranks that we give to species. SNR just means that it hasn't been ranked yet. So if we have a new species for the province, There's just not information yet. We haven't actually gotten around to assessing it. We'll give it an SNR. SNA means subnational rank not applicable, so that's usually for things that have been introduced to the province because they have no conservation value as it is. And SU is unrankable, so that's for something that would probably be data deficient, where we just have truly no idea and we can't give it any rank of any sort. We would use that instead of SNR to basically say that we've looked at it and we can't give it a rank. SNR is sort of, we haven't had time to even look at it yet. So for animals, and I do apologize, I am a botanist at the CDC, so everything I talk about tends to have a very plant-centric slant to it. Try and slot some animals in here and there. For the animals, they get some letter modifiers with their ranks. So for the example here for the short-eared owl is an S3B and S2N. So the B stands for the breeding population, the N stands for the non-breeding population. So if you see a letter after a numeric rank like that, only for animals, and it's going to mean something specific. There's a bit of a list of the different letters that can follow a rank, and those are on our website if you're interested. So when we look at subnational ranks or S ranks, if we're looking solely at the S rank, not all is equal. So here we have Turner's Willow and we have World Milkweed. If we look at the subnational ranks, Turner's Willow is an S1, S2, World Milkweed is an S1. So Turner's Willow could be more common than the World Milkweed. So if you were looking solely at these S ranks, you might, if you had to prioritize your work, you might say, okay, well, the one that's an S1 is more, is at a higher extirpation risk, so let's focus our efforts on that. So we have to also take the national and the global ranks into account. So in this case, Turner's Willow is an endemic species to Saskatchewan. So that means it's found nowhere else in the world. So that means it also has a very high extirpation risk nationally and globally. Whereas if we look at the World Milkweed, it's rare, relatively rare in Saskatchewan, but that's only because it's on the edge of its range here. So nationally, it's actually relatively common. It's an N4, and globally, it's really secure. There's basically no extirpation risk because you find it more commonly as you go south. So with this information in mind, if you had to prioritize your conservation work, you probably want to focus on the Turner's Willow because the national and global ranks just give you a really bigger picture. So why do we put all of our effort into this ranking system? What's the point? Why is it important? Well, as I mentioned, the S ranks, all of the ranks actually, it helps us give a measure of conservation concern to every species, and it helps us to prioritize our activities. So conservation activities are going to be focused on the species that are S1, S2, S3, and S1 again being, sort of more higher priority, than something that's an S3 usually. And again, looking at the national and global ranks helps us refine that a little bit. When there are development projects going in on the ground, avoidance and mitigation measures are required for species that are S1 to S3. So some protection is awarded to them. So getting a little bit more in depth then into the ranking process. So ideally, we would want to rank every species within 10 years. That has not happened in the past. It is not happening now. There's just far too many species. Saskatchewan is a big place and there's a lot of work to do. But that's sort of, in an ideal world, things change. We get more information. Things change on the ground, on the landscape. And so we want to have, an up-to-date picture of what's going on for every species in the province, if we can. So before we had the rank calculator, ranks were given based on expert opinion from knowledgeable people. And that was fine, but again, it was less objective, it wasn't repeatable necessarily. So the tool that we have now is great. We do have a large number of species to go through, however. So what is this process? So first of all, we're going to prioritize our species. Something that we did for the plants in the past year was actually ask some of our client groups, what are some species that you think need a reassessment for the rank? Are there things that we have ranked as rare that you think are more common? Are there things that we have ranked as common that you think we need to look at a little more closely that might actually have a lot of threats? That sort of thing. So we're going to pick the species that we want to work on. Our next step is to gather and compile as much information on that species as we can. So as I mentioned, we've got our own observations in the CDC database. We've got herbarium and museum information. We're going to map that spatial data. Next, we do something that is called creating element occurrences. So an element occurrence is taking an observation, element occurrences are made up of observations that are of conservation significance. So just because you saw, I don't know, a whooping crane fly overhead, that's an observation. That doesn't necessarily mean it was of conservation significance. Where the whooping crane landed, maybe there's a stopover place for its migration, maybe it's nesting, that might be of conservation significance, and that might become an element occurrence. So we have to take the data in our database and sift through it and turn the important observations into element occurrences, because that's what we use in our ranking. So just as a little bit of a side note, we get a lot of questions sometimes at the CDC about, well, I sent you a whole bunch of observations, and I logged into the wildlife app, and I don't see them there. What are you guys doing with all of this data? So this is really where we get hung up in our processing, is with these element occurrences. So it's very time consuming. It has to be done by species, and the element occurrences are what our users see on the wildlife app. So even if we've entered your observations, if we haven't processed them into element occurrences yet, that's why they don't show up. And it is, as I mentioned, very time consuming by species. So it does take a long time for that data to actually show up for our users to be able to use. So after we do our element occurrences, we are going to assess the rank factors, and we do get some expert input on that. So again, the rarity, excuse me, the trends and threats. We're going to put that information into our rank calculator, and then we will have either a panel of experts or an expert on a specific group review that rank to make sure that it makes sense. And I'll just give a quick shout out on the plant side of things. We have our botanical assessment group with a number of different partners that assist me with the rankings. We do threats assessments. We do sort of that review of the summary information. And those people are very helpful. We have one in the audience tonight. And we also have a faunal ranking program. That one, it's a bit more specific. So for each species that's being ranked, we have to go sort of locate an expert for that group to help us, or maybe not necessarily to help us, but to review the information to make sure that the rank that we're coming up with is correct, or good representation. So let's start with raw data. This is going to be tricky to see, especially if it's viewed online, but this is a sort of a typical spreadsheet that I might get that somebody sends to me with a bunch of occurrences, a bunch of observations that I then need to process and get into our database. So I've blanked out the location information here because that's not necessarily something the public gets to see. I then take it and I put it into our database, and so we get these happy little green dots, which are all plants, and that's what that looks like in our GIS component. Then we pick our species that we're going to look at, and we filter the data for that species. So I'm going to give you the example here of Caris passiflora, or few flowered sedge, which is something that we ranked just recently. So if I filter my data for that species, this is what it looks like. So these are all the observations that the CDC has on this species. So I'm going to zoom in. This Wollaston Lake area right here. So we have a little context. So when we zoom in, we can see that there are sort of clusters of occurrences. That doesn't mean that the species doesn't occur in between the clusters. It's just that nobody's observed it there yet, but they maybe haven't looked for it there. So this is where the element occurrence processing comes in. These are all observations, all these dots. I have to take these, process it, see which ones are of significance. And really for plants, if you saw it somewhere growing in the ground, it counts for an element occurrence. We also, element occurrences are grouped based on sort of habitat connectivity, location use class for animals, so whether it was breeding, whether it was just migratory, and also the distance in between observations. So those are all things that we take into account to do our element occurrences. We then summarize the data. So this is just a spreadsheet that we made up at the CDC to sort of gather the information into sort of a concise format. So for this particular species, we have 46 element occurrences, and I'll point out that occurrences that are historical do not get included in our ranking process because it's not considered recent enough information. So you'll notice my note off to the side here is that we have 52 total element occurrences, but 6 of them are historical, so those don't count. Again, we try and get up-to-date information if we can, but that's not always available. So we have 192 observations. So those are what get processed into these 52 element occurrences. We have a population estimate here. We have a range extent. We have a number of element occurrences with good viability, and then a little bit more information. So what is the global rank, the national rank in Canada, maybe the rank for some neighboring provinces, some comments on threats, and a map here. This map is taken directly from Nature Explorer, and it just gives you sort of a visual summary of how the species is doing in other jurisdictions. So the range extent, this is actually pretty easy. We just throw the data into a GIS application, tell it to calculate the range extent for us, and that's what it does. So the range extent is really straightforward. There's really no judgment calls there. The nature methodology calls for using what's called a convex hull to determine the range extent. So that's what this looks like for this particular species. And what I'm going to do now is take you to the rank calculator to show you what it looks like. So it's not terribly fancy, it's just an Excel spreadsheet with a whole bunch of macros in the background that will calculate the rank for you. So the first thing that I'll show you, this is the main page, and we'll come back to this. And I'm just going to show you what the threats assessment sheet looks like. So this is a species that has already been reassessed, so the threats assessment has been filled out for it. And this is something that the Botanical Assessment Working Group does together to come up with the threat level for the species. So that list of threats that I showed you before, they're all highlighted in blue here, and there's also a number of sub-threats underneath those. So we look at all of these different threats for each species again. So in this particular case, mining and quarrying, there is a threat level for that, low. And we're looking at the scope and the severity. So scope being how much of the entire population in Saskatchewan is being affected, severity being of the population that's being affected, how badly is it being affected, and also the timing. So is it happening right now? Is it expected to happen in the near future, or is it sort of a, way in the future, could happen, not really sure, that kind of thing. So this is what helps us calculate our threat level. And again, it's all sort of, there's macros in the background, it all makes it pretty, and it does it for you once you enter your scopes and your severities. So we had mining and quarrying for this particular species. We had an unknown impact from roads and railroads. And we also had an unknown impact from habitat shifting and alteration. So when all is said and done, it calculates it nicely for you up here. It's telling me that my threat, overall threat impact is low. So I assign it low, and then if we go back to calculator, you'll see that it plunks it in there for me, and on the bottom here. So, I'm hoping we can see this, and I don't think anyone that sees this online is going to have a very good view of this. But this box right here at the bottom where it says SU, right now that means unrankable because there's nothing really filled out in here, it has no information. But this is the box to watch as I start entering things, and you'll see the rank change as we enter different information. So again, this is the rank calculator tool that is sort of compiling everything for me into a rank. So we have our range extent, which was calculated using that convex hull, 184,000 square kilometers. So we fill that in, you'll see this is still unrankable because it cannot give a rank based on only one factor. It needs more than that. There's sort of a minimum of a number of factors, and also a minimum of types of factors that it needs to give you a rank. We have, and I should point out too, you'll notice that the values in these drop-down menus are ranges. So there's always a bit of wiggle room when you're trying to come up with, say, a population estimate, or if there's anything that's uncertain, if it falls right into the middle of one of these categories, right in the middle of the range, then you know you've pretty much captured some of the uncertainty already in there. We also have allowance to select more than one category. So in this case, we use the FG, which is 10,000 to 1 million individuals. We have, of the plants that have been counted, there's about 57,000 of them. However, we also have a lot of observations when plants weren't counted, which account for almost half of the observations. So we know that it's probably at least double 57,000 individuals, probably also more than that. So that's why we picked this category. You can see now that this has made it into an S4. We are also going to fill in the number of occurrences, which is 33. Or with good probability, sorry. And number of occurrences as well. So that was fairly interesting because it's stated at an S4. But if I take population size out, it knocks it back to an S3. So without that high number of individuals, it's saying, okay, based on the information we've got in here right now, we can only sort of determine that it's an S3, but because the population estimate is actually quite high, it bumps it up to an S4. So out of that range of conservation concern. And when I put the low category in here, it also does not change it. If we had come out with a threat assessment of very high, it knocks it down to an S3 question mark, which means most likely an S3, possibly an S4, possibly an S2. So that threat level actually has a huge impact on the rank that is put out from this calculator. So again, all the ranking is not just based on where the threats has a lot to do with it as well, and of course the trends as well. We generally don't have a lot of good trend information, especially for the plants, so it's not something that we use very often unless we have really good information on trends. So that's just a little glimpse at the rank calculator tool. So that's one of the ways that we do our data interpretation, the way that we actually use our data. So just to give you an idea of some of the ways that we do our data distribution, we have a number of outlets, I guess, for our users. We have Saskatchewan Bird Atlas Online, we have our wildlife application, we do fact sheets, provincial species lists, we get specific data requests where we'll compile information for a specific purpose for somebody. We work on survey protocols and setback distances. We provide information for CWIC assessments, which are for the national level. We've done distribution models and that kind of thing as well. So lots going on with the data that we collect for different groups. So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and get into sort of our species listing and taxonomy a little bit, naming standards. So the CDC strives to be sort of a one-stop shop for current taxonomy and species lists for the province. Plants especially are changing a lot right now, with a lot of work going on with the Flora of North America, which is the standard that NatureServe is going to be following in the future. So that sort of, I guess messes up your picture of what groups look like and what things are called. As soon as somebody does maybe a phylogenetic study or something like that, things get rearranged, and names change, and so sometimes it's hard to follow. So we try and bring that information together for people to have it all in one place. So taxonomy is not static. It would be nice if it was, because then we could all just, call something what we've been calling it all along, and we wouldn't have to learn new names. But The old classifications were usually based on morphology or distribution, and with all of the molecular and cellular work that's going on, all the DNA work, we're learning that in some cases we were wrong with our classifications, so things are changing. It can get complicated, so here we have a picture of what used to be 3 aster species. We still use the common name aster because that's what they've always been called. However, this group was revised. We have 2 Cynthia trichomes now, and I'm going to probably mispronounce this, but a Euredia. So these species that were all used to be asters have now been changed. So this is the kind of thing that we keep track of on our species lists, hopefully for people to be able to access that and know what things are being called now, so that we're all using a consistent standard. So I'll just maybe point out that it's not the CDC that determines what the standard is. We just bring it all together in one place. So there are other people out there doing the research, determining what we're supposed to be calling things in order to classify them properly. And we're just bringing it together for our users. Oh, as a side note, there is 1 aster species left. All of the asters got moved into other genera. But there's 1 aster species left in North America. We don't have it in Saskatchewan. So, after seeing some of what the CDC does, how can you help us with conservation? As I mentioned, we can't do anything without data, and we can't do anything without quality data. So the more information that we have, and the better the information that we have, the better that we can make good decisions for species of conservation concern in the province. So you can help us by submitting your data to the CDC. And I promise you, we do use it, even if you don't necessarily see it show up on the wildlife app right away or as fast as you would like it to show up. We're using it, we're working on our data backlog as well, we're getting it in there, and we still want that information. So we need a sort of a minimum of information. There's a standard that we're using for our clients now, but for somebody in the public that goes out and sees whatever they might see, a burrowing owl, a small woodbine plant, and they want to report it to us, we just need a minimum of information, including observer, date, species, location, which we prefer GPS coordinates. But if you don't have a GPS, really detailed directions will do. Other things that we like to have, habitats, and number of plants in here again, because it's sort of plant-centric, but the number of individuals that you saw, or sort of a life history, were they young, were they breeding adults, that kind of thing for animals. Photos are handy, again, directions to the site. We do have to be reasonably, or have some reasonable amount of certainty in the observations that people are sending to us. So, if we've never had an observation from you before and we don't have any verification of what you saw, we may not be able to use that occurrence just because of the uncertainty surrounding it. So if you have photos, that's really handy. Then we know what you saw, or what you're telling us you saw is what you actually saw. In some cases, for plants especially, taking a specimen might be appropriate. There's a lot of guidelines surrounding that when it is and is not appropriate, that kind of thing. So I'm going to put our website up here for anybody to visit. We've had a new website since it was about a year ago, I think. Our new website went up, and it's really great. There's a lot of good information there. We have a frequently asked questions site or webpage, including things like, I sent my data to the CDC, why isn't it showing up on the wildlife app, and a host of other really good questions and answers there. So just in conclusion, the CDC is really sort of, I'll say, a bridge between the government and users of the data, or a bridge between the data itself and the users. We're the keepers of the data for the province. We want to do our best to inform conservation measures so that those species that are of high extirpation risk don't disappear altogether, and species that are not at any, level of extirpation risk don't become, of concern for extirpation at all. We provide a lot of tools for other people. We focus mostly on elements, but we're hoping to move to looking at communities as a conservation unit. And so yeah, visit our website, and we're also, I guess, as providers of information, we want to hear from our users. So if there's something that the CDC doesn't currently do that you think it could do that would be very useful, feel free to let us know. There's a bunch of contact information on the website if you want to give us a shout. We'd be happy to take suggestions. Recently, we had a suggestion from somebody to include a synonym list for the plants, especially. All the changes that have been going on, people don't know what things are called, and it's hard to search out the new name from our lists. So we are, as of yesterday, working on a list that is sort of comprehensive of all the scientific names that have really ever been used in Saskatchewan, and if they are no longer accepted names or no longer, current, we're going to put the synonym beside it so that people can figure out what things are called. One of the other things that we are doing is, I didn't put it on here. We haven't started it yet. To be determined, and we do have a news page on our website, so you can see, if ranks are changing, we post it on there. If we've got some new tool or something that we think people would find really helpful, we try and post it on there so that people can see what's new and what's going on. So, thanks again, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience if there are any. Yes.
I was wondering if there's any variation in how the ranking tool is used between provinces. Do they have the option to tweak it?
The tool itself is set. You can't. I mean, if somebody wanted to go into the background of it and start messing around with it, they could. The idea behind the tool is to keep it standardized between jurisdictions. However, not every jurisdiction is currently using it either. I think the first version of it appeared in the mid to late 2000s. The most recent version was 2011, so it's still relatively new, and some jurisdictions are still catching up. So, in some cases, they are still using expert opinion for some assessments. But this is hopefully, NatureServe developed this in the hopes that everybody would move towards using it for the reassessment of everything. So that, again, it would be objective, it would be very transparent about, how that rank was arrived at. There's a bit of objectivity that goes into parts of it, like the threats assessment, whether it was, you're looking at, say, oil and gas impacts, was it small in scope, is it large in scope, there's a bit of wiggle room in there, and that's why we try and have a discussion with a number of different people to come up with those threats assessments. But for the most part, just trying to keep it consistent as possible.
Sarah, could you talk a little bit about some of the field work that you did, maybe for the upcoming year, if you had anything planned in particular, or just describe the field work?
Yes, field work. We are working on a prioritization list for all of the species in the province to help us direct our fieldwork activities. On the plant side of things, we are trying to update some of our older occurrence information. So when I mentioned that we have historical occurrences in the database, it doesn't mean that they're not still out there on the landscape. It means that nobody's been out there to check in 20 to 40 years. So we have a very aging data set in some cases, and we want to do our best to update that. So that's something that we're going to be working on. Sort of the older the data for a particular species, the higher of a priority that it's going to be. We do work with the Ministry of Environment, and depending what some of their priorities might be, we help them with their field work as well. And so it's kind of a mixed bag. We haven't really set down what our priorities are going to be for the upcoming year, because we're still sort of wrapping up this season. But we are working towards sort of a more standardized way of picking the species that we want to focus on for a given year. So I guess the south of the Divide area has been sort of a hot spot for fieldwork in the past few years, which is sort of the Consul area, I guess, to generalize. And that's sort of ongoing. And but yeah, beyond that, we haven't really gotten around to the specifics yet. I know I have my wish list, but we'll see when we sit down in a meeting what we might be working on. So, Andrew?
As far as taxonomy, is there any changes that occur in Florida, North America that aren't accepted by the SBCC?
So the question there was for plants, if there are changes to taxonomy that are in the Florida, North America that the CDC doesn't accept. Generally, no. However, there may be occasional instances where we feel that the Florida, North America has overlooked something for Saskatchewan. I can give you one example. So the Flucose tansy that's found in the Athabasca region, Florida, North America does not consider that to be an accepted variety. So we consider it to be its own variety, the one that's found in Athabasca. Florida, North America lumps them all together and says, no, they're all one species. If they're one species, then it's common throughout the province. But that particular taxon is currently also listed by CSIWIC and on the Species at Risk Act. So it's something that we choose to keep separate mostly because it has a national status. And if that national status ever changes, or if CSIWIC decides to go with what Florida, North America has done there, then we'll probably lump them as well. But that's one particular example. I can't think of any others at the moment. There are instances where Florida, North America has excluded a certain taxa from Saskatchewan erroneously. So in that case, we still include them because we know that they've been found here. We have herbarium records. But yeah, as a general rule, we try and follow North America.
What's been one of the most exciting plants that you've discovered, I guess?
The most exciting plants. Well, we were there when the Native Plant Society, on the Native Plant Society tour, when they found the short flower suncup, which hadn't been seen. That was one of those species that had a very aging data set. We hadn't seen it in more than 40 years. So I was lucky enough to be on that trip and get to see that one. With some hesitation, I'll say that we may have found a new species for the province this summer. We're waiting on some confirmation from the specimen that was sent to the herbarium. So I don't want to get too excited about it yet. And I don't want to tell anybody what it is in case we were wrong. But that would be very exciting, especially because it was found in the southern part of the province. So you tend to think that the southern part of the province has been fairly well covered. So finding a plant species there would be pretty cool, but to be determined. Any day now, hopefully I'll hear whether or not.
Well, just check the website to find out.
Yes, it will be on the website if that's the case for sure. So check our news page. Any other questions? Yeah, Andrew.
So are there species that are currently ranked as SNR that field crew should be on the lookout for, or reporting that data even though it's not currently listed?
I'm not really sure about the animals. I know that our invertebrates list is almost completely composed of species with ranks of SNR because just nobody's had time to really look at them much. Same goes for a lot of the bryophytes, and our bryophytes list actually needs a lot of work as well. The lichens are better, but there's still a number there that are SNR. For the plants, those that had ranks of SNR was basically just because they were added as taxa to the provincial list and just nobody had gotten around to assessing what their rank might be. With the help of the Botanical Assessment Working Group, we've actually, I think we started out with about 300 species that were SNR, and we're down to about 30. And And we're actually just in the last iteration of giving those 30 a rank. So anything that is thought to be of conservation concern, like, you know, we haven't maybe assessed it, but we're pretty sure it's going to be an S3 or less, we've already put it on the tracking list, even though it's ranked as SNR, and hopefully we'll be able to get some data on it from the herbarium is our sort of our starting point.